the way that you talked about the discrepancies in the gospel accounts. And that's something that I also like struggled with. I think I've always kind of like looked forward to seeing like those things in the study Bible where it shows like the parallels between the gospels, where it's like the chart of like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and you see like the various stories that are similar, right? Like I
Yeah.
always like, okay, I got find like, okay, that shows me that there's consistency and the harmony of the gospel. So I always found that like helpful. But then there's
Mm.
always those things that are different. But then like, oh, wait a minute, this author's saying this. And that's always something I've also struggled with.
That's right. I mean, there are discrepancies. I mean, one of the big ones which I mentioned is the cleansing of the temple when Jesus throws out the money lenders and so on. And in John's Gospel, that's one of the first things he does. In the other Gospels, it's one of the last things he does before the Passion, before the arrest and crucifixion. Now, unless he did it twice, one or other of those accounts isn't right in the sense of being historically accurate. But St. Augustine was faced with that and with other discrepancies and said, none of the discrepancies in the Gospels detract from the actual picture of Jesus you get there. But they're clearly describing the same person, even though they tell some of the details slightly differently. Now, that may be a little bit of a fudge. I mean, sometimes the discrepancies perhaps go a bit further than you can deal with that way. But nevertheless, he's right in principle that we've got a picture of Jesus from the Gospels, which isn't falsified if some of the detail is not dead accurate. I mean, Augustine discusses where in one Gospel Jesus says, I'm not worthy, John the Baptist says, I'm not worthy to bend down and unlatch his sandals. In another he says, I'm not worthy to carry his sandals. Now Augustine said, well, which did he say? Well, it could easily have been either, and people may have misremembered. But the point he was making is still the point that Jesus is much more important than I am. And that stands, even though there are discrepancies. And we shouldn't work ourselves up over the discrepancies to an unnecessary extent. That seems to me that's a sensible way of looking at the problems. And as you say, at least with the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we've obviously got the same story, even though if you do the parallel columns, you find discrepancies between them. The problem is John, which tells a rather different story of Jesus, in which he, for example, in which he visits Jerusalem a number of times, whereas in the other Gospels you get the impression he goes up once to Jerusalem. So there are problems there. And the Jesus of John's Gospel isn't like the Jesus of the other Gospels. He's a more mystical sort of figure. But nevertheless, I think the point's a sound one, that when you look at parallel columns, you can say, well, we are dealing with stories about the same person, even though there are differences in detail.